Dr. Patricia Hale slammed the chart down on the nurse's station counter so hard the entire ICU floor went quiet. "I don't care what that man thinks he's doing." She snapped her voice low and razor sharp, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to cut. "He is not family. He has no authorization, no medical background, no business being in that room." She pointed one finger at the night nurse, Karen, like she was signing an order. "If I see him in room 305 again, I want security called. I want him escorted out. And I want it documented that he was removed for patient interference." She straightened her coat, picked up her coffee, and walked away without waiting for a response. Karen stood there holding her clipboard, staring at the empty hallway. Because the man Dr. Hale was talking about hadn't done a single harmful thing. He had only come in, sat down, and sung. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. David Miller had never considered himself a particularly emotional man. He would have been the first to admit that. His ex-wife Sandra had told him as much during the final argument that ended their marriage, the one where she stood in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night and said, "David, I don't think you actually feel anything. I think you just watch things happen." He hadn't argued with her. He wasn't sure she was wrong. That was 3 years ago. Since then, he'd settled into a life that ran on schedule and nothing else. He woke at 6, made coffee, drove 40 minutes to his job at the water treatment facility in Millhaven, came home, ate whatever was in the refrigerator, and went to bed. On weekends, he had his kids, Tyler, who was 14, and had recently decided that speaking in full sentences was optional, and Sophie, who was 11 and still occasionally held his hand when they walked across a parking lot. Those weekends kept him going. Those were the only hours of the week when David Miller felt like he was actually standing inside his own life instead of watching it from somewhere across the room. Then his grandmother got sick. Eleanor Miller, Nana L, as everyone called her, had always been the loudest person in any room she entered. She was 79 years old, 4'11", and had opinions about everything from the proper way to fold laundry to the moral failings of whoever was currently on the evening news. She had raised David's father after his grandfather died young, then helped to raise David himself when his parents went through their own rough patch in the late 90s. She was the person David called when something good happened, and also when something bad happened, and somehow she always knew which kind of call it was before he said a word. In November, she slipped getting out of the bathtub. The fall wasn't catastrophic, a bruised hip, a hairline fracture in her wrist, but at 79, even small falls carry weight. The doctors at St. Mary's Hospital kept her for observation. They wanted to make sure there was no hidden trauma, no internal bleeding, no damage that hadn't made itself known yet. She was expected to stay for 2 to 3 weeks, and David drove up every night after work to sit with her. It was a 45-minute drive from Millhaven to St. Mary's, and he made it every single evening without exception. He told himself it was because she needed company. He didn't examine it any more deeply than that. St. Mary's was a large hospital, the kind that had been added on to so many times over the decades that the floor plan made no logical sense. The original building connected to a newer wing through a corridor that always smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old carpet, and the ICU was on the 3rd floor of the east wing, a place most visitors only found by following the colored lines painted on the linoleum until the right one curved toward a set of double doors. David had learned the route by heart in the first week. He knew which elevator was fastest, knew the security guard at the front desk by name, a quiet man named Hector who always gave David a nod and a "how's she doing tonight?" and knew exactly which vending machine on the 2nd floor still had the honey-roasted peanuts that Nana L liked. He had been doing this for 3 weeks when it happened. It was a Tuesday. He remembered that specifically later because Tuesdays were his longest days at work. The weekly systems check ran until 5:30, which meant he didn't leave Millhaven until nearly 6, which meant he hit the tail end of rush hour traffic on Route 9, which meant he arrived at St. Mary's later than usual, closer to 7:30. He was tired in the particular way that tired felt at 42, not just physically, but somewhere deeper, a fatigue that lived behind his eyes and in the hinges of his jaw. He had picked up a bouquet of yellow tulips from the gas station near the hospital because Nana L had mentioned offhandedly the week before that she missed having flowers in her room. The tulips were slightly wilted and wrapped in plastic that crinkled too loudly, but they were yellow and she had said yellow. He stepped off the elevator on the third floor, turned left out of habit, walked the length of the corridor, and pushed through the double doors into the ICU at St. Mary's had 14 rooms arranged in a horseshoe around a central nurses' station. Each room had a large window facing the station so the nurses could monitor patients visually, as well as through the monitors. Most rooms had the blinds partially drawn, offering privacy, while still allowing line of sight. David had been walking this corridor for 3 weeks. He knew the rhythm of it, the soft beeping of monitors, the muted conversations at the nurse's station, the particular squeak the floor made near room 308, where the linoleum was lifting at one corner. He turned right at the second corridor junction, pushed open the door to room 305, and walked in. The room was dim. The overhead lights were off, and the only illumination came from the monitors and a small lamp near the head of the bed, casting everything in that particular hospital glow, greenish, slightly underwater, the kind of light that exists nowhere else in the world. He set the tulips down on the small table near the door and pulled the chair closer to the bed, the way he always did, and sat down. And then he looked at the woman in the bed. She was not his grandmother. David went very still. His brain did that thing brains sometimes do in moments of shock. It refused to process the information, completely offered it back to him in pieces. The hair was wrong. Nana L had silver white hair she kept in a tight braid. This woman's hair was loose, spread across the pillow, the color of ash lighter. The hands were different too, longer fingers, more fragile looking. The face was unfamiliar in the specific way that a stranger's face is unfamiliar, which is to say completely. He stood up so fast the chair scraped back across the floor. He looked at the door, then at the room number on the wall. Room 305. That was his grandmother's room number. He looked back at the woman in the bed, at the monitors, at the IV lines running into the inside of her elbow, at the feeding tube. He looked at the small whiteboard on the wall across from the bed where patient information was sometimes written, and he saw a name in blue dry erase marker. Margaret Thompson. "Oh God," David said out loud to no one. "Wrong room." He grabbed the tulips and stepped back toward the door, and that was when he heard it, or rather didn't hear it, because the room was completely, utterly silent except for the machines. No television, no radio, no family member in the corner chair, no get well cards on the windowsill, no personal photographs taped above the bed, no evidence that anyone had been here recently at all. The whiteboard had her name and her diagnosis, ischemic stroke, coma day 42, and nothing else. No next of kin listed, no attending visitor, just a name and a number, and a silence so complete it had its own weight. David stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at Margaret Thompson. She was somewhere in her mid to late 70s, he guessed, though it was hard to tell. Her face in the dim light had the particular stillness of deep unconsciousness. Not sleep, which has its own subtle movement, but something further down than sleep. Her chest rose and fell with the help of the machines. Her hands lay at her sides, open palms up, in the posture of someone who had simply let go of everything. He should have left. He knew that. He took one step back, and then he stopped. 42 days. The board said day 42. She had been lying here for 42 days and no one had come. He didn't think about it consciously. He didn't make a decision exactly. What he did was walk back into the room, set the tulips back down on the table, pull the chair to the bedside, and sit down. He sat there for a while without doing anything. Just sitting. The monitors beeped. The ventilator cycled. Outside in the corridor, he could hear the distant sound of a cart being wheeled. A phone ringing at the nurse's station, a brief exchange between two staff members he couldn't make out. He didn't know why he started singing. He would try to explain it later and never quite find the right words for it. He wasn't a singer. He had never sung in public in his life, had mouthed the words at church as a teenager, rather than let anyone hear him, had not sung anything except maybe snatches of songs in the car when he was alone. But sitting there in the dim glow of the monitors with a stranger who had been alone for 42 days, something moved in him, something older than logic, something that lived in the part of the chest that tightens when you see something heartbreaking happening to someone who can't help themselves. He sang "You Are My Sunshine," quietly, barely above a whisper. The song his grandmother had sung to him when he was sick as a kid, tucked into the couch under the big green blanket, running a fever, watching her move around the kitchen. He'd hated being sick, but secretly loved the way she fussed. He'd heard that song 100 times, 1,000 times, and it was in his muscle memory in a way very few things were. His voice was rough and off-key, and he forgot one of the verses and had to start it again. He sang it through once, then sat in silence, feeling slightly ridiculous. Nothing happened, of course. Margaret Thompson lay exactly as she had been lying. The machines continued their work. He found his grandmother's room 308, not 305, and he had taken the wrong turn at the corridor junction and spent an hour with Nana L., who was in a fine mood, and had strong opinions about the nurse on the previous shift and wanted to know if he'd remembered to water her plants at home. He had not remembered to water her plants. She gave him a look that communicated exactly what she thought of that. He drove home and went to bed, and that should have been the end of it. Except he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Thompson. He thought about her the next morning while he was making coffee. He thought about her on the drive to work. He thought about the whiteboard day 42, no next of kin, the empty chair, the tulips he'd left on her table because it had seemed wrong to take them back after he'd already set them down. He thought about the particular quality of the silence in that room, the way it felt different from the silence in Nana L's room, where there were cards and a small stuffed cat from Sophie and a photograph of the family tucked into the frame of the mirror. Nana L's room felt occupied even when she was alone. Margaret's room felt like a room that had forgotten it was waiting for someone. The next night after visiting his grandmother, David walked back down the corridor and stood outside room 305 for a long moment. Through the window, he could see the monitors, the steady green lines, the rise and fall of the chest. He pushed the door open. The tulips were still there in a small plastic pitcher someone had filled with water. He sat down in the chair. "I don't know if you can hear anything," he said. His voice felt strange in the room, too present, too alive. "I don't know how any of this works, but I figured I'm here anyway and you're here and it doesn't seem right that nobody's talking to you." He paused. "My name is David. I came in here by accident last night. Wrong room, but I left you my flowers." He glanced at the tulips. "You can keep those. They're a little rough looking, but they're doing okay." He stayed for 20 minutes that night. He talked about nothing about traffic on Route 9, about the systems check at work, about how Tyler had texted him 3 times that day, and every text was a question about whether David could increase Tyler's allowance. When he left, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something he would have had trouble naming accurately. It was not happiness, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of having done something that needed to be done, a quiet rightness. He came back the next night and the night after that and the night after that. The nurses noticed. Of course they noticed. On his 4th visit, a young nurse named Jenny intercepted him in the corridor. She was maybe 26, quick-moving with her hair in a practical bun and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who hadn't yet decided which direction the conversation was going to go. "Are you family of Mrs. Thompson in 305? "No," David said, "I'm not." "Are you a friend?" He considered that. "I don't know her," he said. "I walked into her room by accident about a week ago. Wrong room number? I've been coming back." Jenny looked at him for a moment. "Why big Wednesday about the pomon?" "Because no one else is." That was the answer that bought him time. Jenny didn't call security. She looked at him the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit into any category they have, and then she nodded slowly and said, "Keep your visits under an hour. Don't touch any of the equipment. If something changes with her, anything, you hit the call button immediately." "I understand," David said. "What's your name?" "David M. Miller." She wrote it down. He didn't know what she wrote it down for and didn't ask. He kept coming, every night. He talked to Margaret Thompson the way he had learned to talk to her, as if she was listening, as if she was following along, as if somewhere behind the stillness and the silence there was someone paying attention. He didn't know if that was true. He had Googled coma research at 2 in the morning, sitting at his kitchen table reading about auditory processing in unconscious patients, about studies suggesting that hearing might persist even when other consciousness didn't. He had read about family members who had talked and read and played music for comatose loved ones. He had read about cases where patients woke and reported having heard things, voices, music, fragments of conversation. He had also read about cases where they woke and reported nothing or didn't wake at all. He told Margaret about Tyler one night, about the boy he'd been before the divorce, when he would still sometimes come into the kitchen on Saturday mornings and want to make pancakes together, and how that had shifted into something quieter and spikier and harder to reach. He told her about Sophie, who had his mother's eyes, and Nana L's stubbornness, and who had recently inexplicably become interested in marine biology. He told her about his marriage, not the ugly parts, but the early parts, the apartment he and Sandra had shared in their 20s, where the radiator clanged all winter and the landlord was unresponsive to every complaint, and somehow they had found it funny rather than maddening, at least at first. He told her about the way things go quiet between two people, how it happens gradually like a tide going out until one morning you look at the person across the breakfast table and realize the distance between you has become the size of a continent, and you're not sure either of you has the energy to cross it. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. He wasn't sure why it was easier to talk in this room to this woman who gave no response, who offered no reaction, who couldn't interrupt or judge, or give well-meaning advice that was slightly off target. Maybe that was exactly it. There was no performance required. There was only speaking. He always sang at the end of each visit, always, "You are my sunshine." Sometimes other things, old hymns he half remembered from his grandmother's church, a folk song his father had played on the radio when David was small, once a Patsy Cline song, because he had heard it on the way to the hospital and it had stuck in his head. His voice didn't improve. It was what it was. But he sang. One night in mid-December, Jenny was at the nurse's station when he walked past, and she looked up and said, without any preamble, "She had more activity on the EEG last week." David stopped walking. "What does that mean?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of someone in a medical setting who knows the limits of what they're permitted to say. "It means there's activity," she said finally. "That's all I can say." He went into the room and sat down and looked at Margaret for a long time before he spoke. "I heard something tonight," he said quietly, "and I don't know what it means for you, but I want you to know that I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "You've got me whether you want me or not, Margaret. That's just the situation." He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but something in the room felt different after that. Not in any measurable way. Not in any way he could have pointed to and said, "Look, there, that thing." Just different. Like the quality of the silence had shifted slightly, like a room that has been holding its breath and released just a fraction of it. He sat there for an hour. He talked. He sang. He drove home in the dark, the road empty, at that hour the radio off, and he thought about what it meant to be present for someone really present, not just physically in the room, but actually fully there. And he realized with a clarity that surprised him that he hadn't been present for most of the people in his life for a very long time. That somewhere in the years of routine and distance and the slow erosion of the marriage and the haze of getting through each day, he had stopped really showing up. For Sandra, for Tyler, for Sophie, for himself. He was showing up for Margaret Thompson, a woman he had never met before, walking into the wrong room. And somehow sitting in that room, talking into that silence, singing his off-key songs to someone who could not respond. Somehow that was the most present David Miller had felt in years. He didn't know yet what that meant. He just drove home and got into bed, and for the first time in a long time, he fell asleep without lying awake in the dark first. And in room 305, the monitors continued their work. The green lines moved. The ventilator cycled. The small yellow tulips replaced now twice with fresh ones David brought without making a point of it, stood in their plastic pitcher by the window. And if something in the room was listening, if somewhere in the deep and silent place where Margaret Thompson had gone, there was any part of her still tracking the sound of a voice, still registering the presence of someone who had walked in by accident and stayed on purpose, then she was not entirely alone. Not anymore. The next morning, Dr. Patricia Hale arrived for her rounds. She reviewed Margaret's chart, noted the EED data, with the flat expression of someone who was professionally skeptical of anomalies, and then asked the day nurse who had been leaving flowers in room 305. The day nurse mentioned David's name. Dr. Hale's expression did not change. She set the chart down, straightened her coat, and walked to the nurse's station, and what she said there would set off a confrontation that nobody on that floor was prepared for. Dr. Patricia Hale did not raise her voice. That was what made her frightening. She stood at the nurse's station with Margaret's chart in one hand and her coffee in the other, and she spoke in the measured, controlled tone of someone who had spent 23 years being the most certain person in every room she entered. "I want his name on the visitor restriction log," she said, "effective today. If he comes back tonight, security is called. I'm not asking for a debate on this. I'm telling you what's going to happen." Karen, the head night nurse, was the one who pushed back. Karen was 54 years old, had worked the ICU at St. Mary's for 16 of those years, and had survived 4 chief physicians, 2 hospital mergers, and a pandemic. She was not easily intimidated. "Dr. Hale," she said carefully, "he's not causing any harm. He comes in, he talks to her, he sings. The EEG data from last week showed increased." "I've seen the EEG data," Dr. Hale said. "Then you know something is happening." "What I know," Dr. Hale said, setting her coffee down with a precise click, "is that correlation is not causation, and that an unauthorized individual with no medical training, no family connection, and no legal standing has been allowed unsupervised access to a vulnerable, non-responsive patient on this ward. And I know that if anything goes wrong, anything at all, this hospital is liable." She picked her coffee back up. "This is not a debate about whether his intentions are good. I'm sure they are. This is about protocol. This is about what we are legally and ethically obligated to do." She looked at Karen directly. "Are we clear?" Karen looked back at her. "We're clear," she said, and then quietly, almost under her breath, "It doesn't make it right." Dr. Hale left. Karen stood at the station and looked at room 305 through the window, at the monitors, at the still shape in the bed, and she thought about what right and wrong actually meant in a place like this, in a situation like this, where a woman had been lying alone for 43 days, and the only person who had shown up for her was a man who'd walked into the wrong room. She picked up the phone and called the number David had written on the visitor log. He answered on the second ring. "Hello, Mr. Miller, this is Karen Salter, night nurse on the ICU 3rd floor at St. Mary's." She paused. "I'm calling to let you know that as of today, the attending physician for Mrs. Thompson has placed a visitor restriction on room 305. You won't be able to come in tonight." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then David said, "Is she okay? Did something happen to her?" "Her condition is unchanged," Karen said. "Then why?" "The physician has concerns about protocol, about authorization." Karen chose her words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, carefully, one step at a time. "You were never formally approved as a visitor. Technically, you were never supposed to have access." Another silence. "I see," David said. His voice was very even. She couldn't tell what was underneath it. "Is there anything I can do, any way to get approved? For non-family members in a case like this with no designated next of kin on record?" Karen paused. "It's complicated. The hospital's patient advocate office would be the place to start. But I want to be honest with you, it's not a fast process." "How long?" "Weeks potentially, maybe longer." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Karen, that's your name, right, Karen? Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Does she have anyone? Anyone at all? Any family, any friend? Anyone who has come to see her in the last 43 days who isn't me?" Karen looked at the window of room 305. "No," she said. "She doesn't." "Then what exactly is the hospital protecting her from?" Karen didn't have an answer for that. She told him she was sorry, and she meant it, and she hung up. David sat in his car in the parking lot of a gas station 3 miles from his house and stared at the phone in his hand for a long time. He wasn't angry exactly. Anger required a kind of energy he didn't have at that moment. What he felt was something closer to grief, the particular grief of having something taken away that you hadn't fully understood you needed until it was gone. He thought about room 305. He thought about the monitors and the green lines and the yellow tulips and the silence that had over the past few weeks become something less like emptiness and more like waiting. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and pulled up the St. Mary's Hospital website, found the patient advocate office contact information, and wrote an email at 11:15 at night explaining who he was, how he'd come to know Margaret Thompson, and why he was requesting visitor access. He tried to write it in a way that didn't sound desperate or strange. He wasn't sure he succeeded. He sent it anyway and went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He lay in the dark and thought about what Karen had said, that Margaret had no one. He'd known that in the factual sense since the first night, but hearing it stated plainly, no. She doesn't. Made it land differently. made it concrete in a way that settled into his chest and stayed there. He thought about the night 2 weeks earlier when he told Margaret about Sophie's marine biology phase, how Sophie had become obsessed with bioluminescent creatures, had filled a notebook with drawings of anglerfish and lanternfish and creatures that made their own light in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. He remembered saying, "I think she's going to do something remarkable, Margaret. I don't know what exactly, but she's got this thing in her, this pull toward understanding the world. I hope I don't mess it up." He had not said anything like that out loud to another living person. He wasn't sure he'd ever formed the thought so clearly even to himself. And there in the dim room, speaking into the silence, something had shifted in him, a loosening like a joint that had been locked for years, finally finding its range of motion again. He needed to get back into that room. He didn't fully understand why, except that whatever was happening there, whatever strange, one-sided, medically unverifiable exchange was taking place, felt like the most important thing in his life right now. And he was not prepared to let a protocol stop it. He called the patient advocate office the next morning before they opened and left a voicemail. He called again at 9 when they picked up. The woman he spoke to was polite and apologetic and explained that in cases involving incapacitated patients with no designated next of kin visitor access for non-family members, required approval from the attending physician and hospital administration, and that the process could take some time. He asked how much time. She said she couldn't say. He asked if there was anything he could do to expedite it. She said he could submit a written statement, which he had already done, and that they would review it. He thanked her and hung up and stared at the ceiling of his office, at the water treatment facility, and thought there has to be another way. Jenny called him at noon. Her voice was low, slightly rushed, the voice of someone calling from a location where they are not sure who can hear them. "Listen," she said without preamble, "I'm not supposed to be doing this, but I wanted you to know Dr. Hale is on the surgical consult rotation this week, which means she's not doing rounds on the ICU floor until Friday. The day attending is Dr. Osei. He's different." A pause. "He asked about you this morning, asked the team who the man was who had been coming in. I told him. He asked a lot of questions. He was," she seemed to search for the right word, "thoughtful about it." "What does that mean?" David asked. "It means I think you should come tonight," Jenny said, "and I think you should bring whatever it is you normally bring." She hung up before he could ask anything else. He brought tulips, yellow ones again. He drove to the hospital that night with the particular feeling of someone walking into a situation whose outcome they can't predict. Not dread exactly, but a heightened awareness, a sharpening of attention. He checked in at the front desk. Hector looked at his name on the log, then looked at David, then back at the log with an expression that suggested he was aware of something David wasn't, and then nodded him through. At the ICU floor, a man was waiting near the nurse's station. He was tall, with a calm, unhurried quality that David recognized immediately as the kind of calm that comes from long practice, the kind doctors develop who have spent years delivering news both good and bad to people who weren't ready to receive it. He extended his hand. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Kwame Osei. I'm the attending physician on duty this week." David shook his hand. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," he said. "You're not officially approved, doctor," Osei said, which was not quite the same thing. "But I wanted to speak with you before I made any decisions about that." He gestured to a small family consultation room off the corridor, and David followed him in. Dr. Osei sat across from him and folded his hands on the table. "Tell me about your visits with Mrs. Thompson." David told him. All of it, the wrong room, the tulips, the 42 days on the whiteboard, the reason he'd come back. He told him about the talking and the singing. He told him about what the silence in that room felt like and what it felt like to do something about it, even if he couldn't measure whether it made a difference. He spoke plainly without trying to make himself sound better than he was. He said, "I know I'm not family. I know I don't have any official connection to her. I just know that she's alone, and I don't think she should be." Dr. Osei listened without interrupting. When David finished, the doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you familiar with the research on auditory awareness in comatose patients?" "Some of it," David said. "I've been reading. There's a significant body of evidence suggesting that hearing persists in states of reduced consciousness beyond what we used to believe. Families are generally encouraged to talk to comatose patients for exactly this reason." He paused. Mrs. Thompson has no family that we've been able to locate. She had a husband who passed away in 2019, a sister who died in 2021. There's a daughter, Rachel, but we've had no response to any of our contact attempts. He looked at David. She is to all practical purposes alone. I know, David said. Our EEG data from the past 2 weeks shows measurable increases in activity during the evening hours, Dr. Osei said. He let that sentence sit for a moment. I'm not in the business of drawing conclusions I can't support, but I'm also not in the business of removing a variable from a patient's environment when the data suggests that variable may be having a positive effect. David was very still. Are you saying I can come back? I'm saying that I'm going to make a temporary modification to the access log effective tonight, noting that you are a designated support visitor under my approval. That approval is mine to give and mine to revoke. He looked at David steadily. If Dr. Hale asks, you can tell her to speak with me. David felt something open up in his chest, not dramatically, not with any particular flourish, just a quiet unclenching, like a hand that's been holding something tightly for a long time and is finally allowed to put it down. Thank you, he said, and he meant it in a way that went deeper than the politeness of the word. He went into room 305 that night and sat down in the chair that had begun to feel like his chair, and he said, I'm back, Margaret. There was a small bureaucratic situation. It's handled. He set the tulips on the table. You keep getting flowers. I figure you'd probably have something to say about that if you could, and it would probably be something very sensible, like that I should be spending my money on better things. But here we are. He talked for a while about the day, about the phone calls, about Dr. Osei, about the feeling of sitting in that consultation room and not knowing which way it was going to go. He talked about the drive over, about a song he had heard on the radio that had made him think of her for no reason he could pin down. And then near the end of the visit, he sang, You Are My Sunshine, then a slow, half-remembered version of Amazing Grace that wandered in pitch, but held its shape the way an old building holds its shape even as things shift inside it. He was in the middle of the second verse when it happened. He felt it first before he understood what it was, a change in the texture of the silence. Something almost atmospheric, the way the air in a room shifts when someone who has been still for a long time makes a very small movement. He stopped singing. He looked at Margaret's hands, which lay on the blanket exactly as they always did, open palms up. Except the fingers of her right hand had moved, just slightly, just enough. 2 fingers curling the smallest possible distance inward, like the beginning of a fist that thought better of it. David's entire body went cold and then hot in the space of a single breath. He leaned forward. He looked at her face. The eyes were still closed, the expression still the unfathomable stillness of deep unconsciousness. But the fingers had moved. He had felt it and seen it, and he was certain of it, in the way you are certain of the things that happen right in front of you when there is nothing else in the room to confuse. He did not hit the call button. Not yet. He reached out slowly and placed his hand over hers gently, barely touching the way you approach something fragile. He held his breath. Margaret, he said very quietly, I'm here. I'm right here. Nothing happened for a long moment. The monitors beeped, the ventilator cycled, and then slowly, as if from a very great distance, as if something had heard him from the bottom of a deep and lightless ocean and was beginning the long ascent toward the surface, her fingers moved again. This time they closed slightly around 2 of his. Not a grip, not a full response, just the faintest possible pressure. The beginning of a signal, the way a radio station comes in before the tuning is right, just the ghost of a frequency, just the edge of something trying to come through. David hit the call button with his free hand and did not let go of hers. Jenny came first, then the charge nurse, then doctor. Osei, who had been 2 floors away and arrived breathing slightly fast from the stairs. The room filled with controlled urgency, the specific, purposeful rush of medical professionals doing what they were trained to do, moving around the bed, checking readings, calling out numbers, adjusting equipment. David stepped back to the wall and watched and felt the particular helplessness of a civilian in a room full of experts, the feeling of being the one person present who has no technical role, who can only stand there and hold the fact of what just happened in their hands and try not to drop it. Her pupils are reactive, someone said. EEG is spiking, said someone else. Dr. Osei was at the bedside speaking quietly and precisely. He looked at the data on the monitors, looked at Margaret, looked at the data again. His face gave away very little, but David, who had spent weeks learning to read the silences in that room, saw something in the set of the doctor's shoulders, something that was not alarm but was not routine either. Something that sat at the exact boundary between the expected and the unprecedented. Dr. Osei turned and looked at David. "What happened?" he asked. "I was singing," David said, and she moved her fingers, her right hand, and then when I held her hand, she pressed back. A little, just a little. The doctor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at Margaret, and David heard him say quietly, almost to himself, the word that David would carry with him for the rest of his life. Remarkable. But what none of them knew in that room in that moment, what none of them could have known, was that the movement of Margaret Thompson's fingers was not the most significant thing that had happened. The most significant thing was something that had happened 3 floors below in the hospital's administrative office, where a woman named Rachel Burnett had opened an email from St. Mary's Hospital for the 4th time and was finally, for reasons she still couldn't have explained to anyone, sitting down to write back. Rachel Burnett had not responded to the first email because she told herself it was spam. She had not responded to the second because she told herself she wasn't ready. She had not responded to the third because she had been sitting at her kitchen table in Burlington, Vermont at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and the email open on her laptop and her hands in her lap, and she simply could not make herself move. The 4th email was different. The 4th email mentioned a man named David Miller. She read that part 3 times. "A man named David Miller, who has been visiting your mother nightly for the past several weeks, has reported a possible motor response this evening. We believe Mrs. Thompson may be showing early signs of emerging consciousness. We strongly encourage any available family to come to the hospital as soon as possible." Rachel closed the laptop. She sat in her kitchen for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on the microwave the entire time, as if measuring the duration of her own paralysis could somehow excuse it. Then she opened the laptop, typed 4 words into the reply field. "I'm coming, Rachel Burnett," and hit send before she could change her mind. She called her husband, Mark, who was already at work. She told him what the email said. He said, "Rachel, this is good. This is what you've been waiting for." She said, "I don't know what I've been waiting for." He said, "Come on, I'll meet you at the house and we'll drive down tonight." She said, "Okay." She hung up. She sat for another minute with her hand on the phone, and then she said, out loud to no one in the kitchen, "I'm not ready for this." And then she stood up and started packing a bag because ready or not had stopped being a relevant consideration. Back at St. Mary's, the night had not yet finished rearranging itself. Dr. Osei had ordered a full neurological workup, new imaging, updated EEG, monitoring a consult request sent to the neuro team for morning. The ICU floor had that specific charged quality that settles over a unit when something medically significant has just occurred. Not chaos, but a kind of electric attentiveness. Everyone moving a little more deliberately, speaking a little more quietly, the way people move in a space where something important is happening and they don't want to disrupt it. David had been moved to the family waiting room at the end of the corridor. Not asked to leave, moved. There was a difference, and Karen had been careful about it, steering him gently with a hand at his elbow and a cup of bad coffee pressed into his hand before he'd fully registered what was happening. "We need the room," she said simply, and he went. He sat in the waiting room and drank the coffee and stared at the door. The room had the particular bleakness of hospital waiting rooms everywhere. The chairs designed to be cleanable rather than comfortable. The side table with outdated magazines, the motivational print on the wall that someone had hung there years ago with the best of intentions, and that now simply existed, neither helping nor hurting like a lot of things in hospitals. He had sat in rooms like this before when his father had his bypass when Sophie broke her arm at 11, and he'd driven to the ER alone because Sandra was out of town. He knew the specific quality of waiting that happened in these rooms, the way time stretched and compressed simultaneously, the way your mind ran through scenarios in a loop, alternating between the best and the worst and unable to settle on either. After 40 minutes, Dr. Osei came through the door. David stood up before he'd consciously decided to. "Sit down, Mr. Miller," the doctor said, and sat across from him. His voice was calm, but it was a careful calm, the kind that's been assembled deliberately. "Her vitals are stable. The imaging is consistent with what we'd expect at this stage. The EEG activity is significant, meaningfully above baseline." "What does that mean in regular language?" Dr. Osei looked at him with the expression of someone who has learned to balance honesty with hope without tipping too far in either direction. It means something is happening. It means she is not where she was 6 weeks ago, or even 2 weeks ago. Whether she will continue to progress, how quickly, to what degree, those are questions I genuinely cannot answer tonight. What I can tell you is that what you reported seeing was consistent with the data. The motor response in the hand, it wasn't a reflex. It was too coordinated for a reflex. David felt the words land in his chest. You're saying she heard me. I'm saying the evidence is consistent with meaningful auditory processing, the doctor said carefully, which is not the same as saying she heard you, but which is also not very far from it. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I go back in? Dr. Osei stood. Not tonight, we're monitoring closely, and I don't want additional variables right now, but come back tomorrow evening. He paused at the door. Mr. Miller, whatever you've been doing in that room, keep doing it. David drove home at midnight. He didn't turn the radio on. He drove in silence and let the night move past the windows, and thought about Margaret's fingers closing around his, that faint, unmistakable pressure, barely more than a suggestion, but real. Completely, absolutely, inarguably real. He thought about what Dr. Osei had said, not very far from it. He called Tyler when he got home, even though it was late, because Tyler was a teenager who kept hours that bore no relationship to the normal human day and would almost certainly still be awake. Tyler picked up on the third ring and said, Dad, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, David said. He sat down at the kitchen table. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pause. That's kind of weird. I know. Are you okay? Yeah, David said. Actually, yeah, I think I am. He paused. How are you? Another pause longer, this time the pause of a 14-year-old recalibrating in response to unexpected sincerity from a parent. I'm fine, Tyler said, and then more slowly. What happened? David told him. Not all of it, not the whole arc of the past several weeks, but enough. He told him about Margaret, about the wrong room, about singing to her, about tonight. He told it simply the way you tell things when you're tired and the filters are down, and the only thing left is what actually happened. Tyler listened. David could tell he was listening because he didn't interrupt, which was unusual enough to be notable. When David finished, Tyler said, She squeezed your hand. Just barely. But yeah, that's why. Tyler stopped. Started again. That's actually kind of incredible, Dad. Yeah, David said, it kind of is. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. The next morning, Dr. Patricia Hale found out. She arrived for her consult rotation, checked the overnight logs, as she always did, and saw the EEG notation on Margaret Thompson's file. She saw Dr. Osei's visitor authorization. She stood at the nurse's station, reading through it with the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they are angry and disciplined enough not to show it immediately. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Osei directly. Karen was near enough to the station to hear one side of the conversation. What she heard was Dr. Hale saying in her measured, controlled voice, I understand you felt there was clinical justification. I'm asking you to explain it to me. A pause. I see. Another pause longer. Kwame, I want to be clear. If this becomes a situation, if this man develops an inappropriate attachment, if the family has concerns, if there is any patient safety issue at all, it lands on both of us. A pause. Yes, fine, but I'm putting my objection on the record. She hung up. She looked at Karen, who had found something extremely interesting to read on her clipboard. Don't, Dr. Hale said, and walked away. Karen waited until she was gone, then looked at room 305, and then at the phone and allowed herself a small, quiet moment of satisfaction. Rachel and Mark arrived at St. Mary's at 7:15 that evening. Rachel had not been to this hospital since her mother's admission 6 weeks ago. Had not she now understood with a guilt that had teeth been back at all? She knew this about herself and could not entirely explain it. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was something more complicated than that, something that lived in the history between her and her mother in the years of friction and distance and the specific particular grief of a relationship that had been difficult long before it became tragic. Her mother had been a hard woman, loving, yes, but in the way of someone who shows love by having standards rather than by saying so. Rachel had spent decades either living up to those standards or failing to, and Either way, the distance had accumulated, and then the stroke. And then the calls to the hospital that Rachel had made dutifully for the first 2 weeks, and then less frequently, and then the emails she hadn't answered because answering them meant making a decision about what she was going to do, and she hadn't been ready to make that decision. She walked through the ICU double doors and up to the nurse's station and said, "I'm Rachel Burnett, Margaret Thompson's daughter." Karen looked up from the desk. Something moved across her face, not surprise, but recognition, the expression of someone who has been expecting a person for a long time. "Mrs. Burnett," she said, "we're glad you're here. How is she?" "She had a significant event last night," Karen said. "The attending will want to speak with you." She paused. "Before that, there are some things I should probably explain." Rachel was shown to the family consultation room. Mark sat beside her and held her hand. "Doctor." Osei came in and explained the situation. The baseline trajectory, the EEG, changes the motor response the previous night. He used careful, measured language, the kind designed to convey information without generating either false hope or unnecessary despair. Rachel listened and asked questions and nodded at the right moments and felt underneath all of it a tidal pull of emotion that she was keeping very carefully below the surface, because this was not the place to let it up. Then Dr. Osei said, "There's something else I need to tell you about, someone who has been involved in your mother's care." Rachel frowned slightly. "The medical team?" "Not exactly," Dr. Osei said, and he told her about David Miller. The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone processing information that doesn't fit into any existing category. Rachel sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry. A stranger has been coming here every night to sing to my mother." "That's essentially accurate, yes." "For how long?" "Approximately 6 weeks." Another silence. Mark beside her said nothing, which was what Rachel needed him to do. She said slowly, "And you think what he's been doing has contributed to what happened last night?" "I think the data is consistent with that," Dr. Osei said. "I can't say more than that with certainty." Rachel looked at her hands. "I want to meet him," she said. David got the call from Karen at 5:30 the next evening, just as he was leaving work. "The family is here," Karen said. "The daughter. She's asking to speak with you before your visit tonight." A pause. "I thought you should know what you were walking into." He sat in his car in the parking lot for a few minutes after hanging up. He thought about what Rachel Burnett might be feeling, what it would feel like to show up after 6 weeks and discover that a complete stranger had been doing what you hadn't. He thought about it from the inside, imagining himself in that chair, receiving that information, and he felt the shape of it clearly enough to be a little afraid of the conversation he was about to have. He drove to the hospital. He found Rachel and Mark in the family waiting room. Rachel was in her mid-50s, he guessed, dark hair, with threads of gray at the temples, her mother's bone structure visible in her face if you knew to look for it, which David now did. She stood when he came in and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostility, not warmth either. Something more complicated, something still deciding. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I'm Rachel." "David," he said, "I'm sorry for what you're going through." "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. They sat. Mark nodded at David from the other chair, and then seemed to understand that this particular conversation was not his to be in, and became very interested in his phone. Rachel looked at David directly. "Tell me why you kept coming back." He told her the truth. He didn't soften it or frame it or package it in any particular way. He said, "I walked into the wrong room, and I saw the date on the whiteboard. 42 days, no visitors, and I couldn't make myself leave." He paused. "I don't have a better explanation than that. I know it's unusual. I know it probably looks strange from the outside." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Did she respond to you before last night?" "Not in any way I could see," David said. "But I believe she could hear me. I couldn't prove it." "What did you talk to her about?" He hesitated. "Everything. My kids, my job, things I was thinking about." He paused. "I told her she was fighting even when she couldn't respond. I told her that every night. That she was fighting." Rachel made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't. She pressed her fingers against her lips for a moment. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were bright. "She hates being told what she's capable of," she said. "My mother." She always has. Somebody telling her she's fighting, she would have had words about that. I figured she probably had opinions, David said. She just couldn't express them. That did make Rachel laugh briefly, and the sound of it was startled and real, and seemed to surprise even her. She pressed her hand to her mouth again, and this time her eyes filled completely, and she let them. She didn't look away. She just sat there and let it happen, and David sat across from her and gave her the space of it. After a moment, she said, "I should have been here." "Yes," David said, because she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was stating a fact, and lying to her with false comfort would have been an insult to her intelligence and to the truth. She nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something?" "Ask." "The song, 'You Are My Sunshine.'" She paused. "How did you pick that?" He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother sang it to me when I was sick as a kid. It came out, first night. It didn't feel like a choice, really." Rachel looked at him. Her expression had shifted into something David couldn't name, but could feel a kind of recognition or a coming to terms, the face of someone standing at the edge of a fact they hadn't been able to accept before, and finding that they can now actually accept it. "My mother used to sing that to me," she said quietly, "when I was very small, before things got complicated." She stopped. "I hadn't thought about that in years." The room was very quiet. It was Mark who spoke first, and what he said was, "Rachel, we should go see her." She nodded. She stood. She looked at David. "Will you come?" she asked. "Would that be, I don't know the protocol." She stopped. "I'll come," David said. The three of them walked down the corridor together. Karen looked up from the nurse's station and watched them and didn't say anything. The door to room 305 opened, and Rachel walked through it for the first time in 6 weeks and stopped. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her mother. David watched her from the doorway, and he saw the exact moment it hit her, the full weight of it, the machines and the tubes and the stillness and the 6 weeks she hadn't been here. And underneath all of that, the older weight, the decades of complicated love and complicated distance, and the specific grief of things left unsaid between a mother and a daughter who were too much alike to always be kind to each other. He saw all of that move through Rachel Burnett in the space of about 4 seconds, and then he watched her walk to the chair at the bedside, his chair, the chair he had sat in every night for 6 weeks, and sit down and take her mother's hand. "Mom," Rachel said. Her voice broke on the single syllable, and she let it. "Mom, I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm here. Well." The monitors beeped. The ventilator cycled. Margaret Thompson lay exactly as she always had, still and distant and unreachable by ordinary means. And then her fingers moved. Not toward David's hand, not toward anyone's in particular. Just moved. A slow, deliberate curl of the right hand, the same hand that had responded the night before, fingers closing as if around something that wasn't there, something imagined or remembered, or half held from a long way off. Rachel made a sound that was not a word. She gripped her mother's hand tighter. "I feel it," she said to David, to Mark, to anyone. "She's moving." "I know," David said from the doorway. "Why shall I know?" Karen appeared beside him, tablet in hand, already pulling up the EEG feed. She looked at the data, then at the bed, then at the data again. And she said in the flat, careful tone of someone who has learned to keep their voice steady in moments that are anything but, "I need to get Dr. Osi." What none of them saw, not David, not Rachel, not Karen reading the EEG data, was what was on the other side of it. The long, dark country where Margaret Thompson had been living for 6 weeks. A place without time or light, but not without sound. Never without sound. Because a voice had been coming through every night, ragged and off-key and absolutely certain of itself. And she had been following it the way you follow the only lit window on a dark street. Not because you're sure of what you'll find, but because it's there and it's warm, and it's pointing towards something that feels after a very long time, like the direction of home. Dr. Osi arrived in 4 minutes. David counted without meaning to, standing in the doorway while Rachel held her mother's hand, and Mark stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and the monitors did what monitors do, measuring, recording, converting the fact of a human life into numbers and lines and the language of machines. 4 minutes from Karen's call to the sound of Dr. Osei's footsteps in the corridor, and in those 4 minutes, Margaret Thompson's right hand moved 2 more times. Not dramatically. Not in any way that looked like the scenes in movies where the comatose person suddenly opens their eyes and speaks clearly, and everyone in the room cries in the right way at the right moment. This was quieter than that. This was two fingers curling and releasing slowly the way a person moves in the lightest edge of sleep, not awake, not gone, but somewhere in the narrow and difficult country between those two things. Rachel held on and didn't say anything, and that was the right thing to do. Dr. O.C. came through the door, looked at the EEG feed on Karen's tablet, looked at Margaret and said, "Mrs. Burnett, I'm going to need to examine your mother. If you can step back for just a moment." His voice was calm and deliberate, and Rachel stood and stepped back and turned and looked at David as if she needed somewhere to direct her eyes, and he held her gaze and gave her a small nod that he hoped communicated something like, "This is good, stay with it, don't fall apart yet." She didn't fall apart. She pressed her lips together and watched the doctor work. Dr. Osei ran through the neurological assessment with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, but who is not, this time treating it as routine. He checked pupillary response, checked tracking, tested stimulus response in both hands. He spoke quietly to Margaret throughout, "Mrs. Thompson, if you can hear me, I need you to squeeze my hand." And on the third attempt, slow and uncertain as a signal coming through static, her hand tightened around his fingers. He straightened. He looked at the EEG data. He looked at Rachel. "Her responses are meaningful," he said. "This is not reflex activity. She is processing." He paused, and David recognized the pause the one Dr. Osei used when he was assembling an honest sentence, making sure every word was weight-bearing before he committed to it. "I want to be careful about expectations. Emergence from this level of unconsciousness is a process, not a moment. It can take days or weeks, and it is not always linear. There will be good hours and difficult hours." He looked at Rachel steadily. "But what I can tell you is that she is moving in a direction, and that is significant." Rachel said, "Will she know us when she comes back? Will she be herself?" That, Dr. Osei said, is the question I cannot answer tonight. What I can tell you is that the areas of her brain involved in language and memory show activity that we would not expect to see in a patient with significant damage to those regions. He paused again, which is encouraging. Rachel absorbed that. Then she asked, "Can he stay?" She looked at David. "He's the one who, can he stay in the room with us?" Dr. Osei looked at David briefly. "For now," he said. So David stayed. He took a chair against the wall away from the bed, and Rachel took the bedside chair, and Mark stood for a while and eventually sat on the wide windowsill, and they stayed in that room together, three people who had not known each other 3 days ago, and they waited. Karen came in every 30 minutes to check the readings. The night wore on. Rachel talked to her mother in a low voice, the way people talk when they're not sure they're being heard, but the talking feels necessary regardless. She talked about Vermont, about the drive, down about her garden, which had been doing well this year, better than last year, the tomatoes especially. She talked about ordinary things, the small change of a life, the kind of news that accumulates between people who are supposed to talk every week and stopped. At one point around midnight, she looked at David across the room and said quietly, "What did you talk to her about all those nights?" "Everything," David said. "My kids, work, things I was trying to figure out." "Did it help talking to her?" He considered the question seriously. "Yeah," he said, "it really did. More than I expected." Rachel looked at her mother. "I think I understand that," she said, and went back to talking. At 12:40, Margaret Thompson opened her eyes. Not both, not fully, not in any way that suggested immediate comprehension of where she was or what was happening. Her left eye opened to about half the lid, trembling with the effort, and the eye beneath it moved slowly, unfocused tracking. Nothing in particular. But it was open. It was open, and Rachel made a sound that David would remember for the rest of his life, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, like someone surfacing from water, and leaned forward and said, Mom, it's Rachel. I'm right here." The eye moved, slowly, as if hearing the word and trying to locate its source. It didn't find her immediately, and then it did, and something happened in it. Not recognition, not yet, or maybe the very beginning of recognition, the first syllable of it, the way a word sounds before you've fully registered what it means. David hit the call button. Karen appeared in under a minute, took one look and said, I'm getting Dr. O.C., and was gone before anyone responded. What followed was controlled and focused and lasted about 30 minutes. And at the end of it, both of Margaret's eyes were open to varying degrees. She had responded to 4 verbal commands out of 7 attempts. And she had said something. It was not a word or not a recognizable one, a sound really rough and effortful, dragged up from somewhere deep-shaped by a mouth relearning the architecture of speech. But it was intentional. Everyone in the room felt it. Karen, who had been a nurse for 16 years and had developed the professional discipline of not displaying her emotions during clinical events, had to turn briefly toward the wall. Dr. O.C. documented everything with meticulous care and then stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Margaret Thompson in a way that David could only describe as respectful, the look of someone in the presence of something that has exceeded the boundaries of what they thought was likely. We'll keep monitoring closely through the night, he said. I want the neuro team here first thing tomorrow morning. Mrs. Burnett, someone from the floor will come get you if anything changes. I'd recommend you try to rest. There's a family room at the end of the hall with a sofa. He looked at David. Mr. Miller. He paused, just for a moment. Thank you for being here. David nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything. In the morning, doctor. Patricia Hale arrived and looked at the overnight report and stood very still at the nurse's station for a long moment. She read it through twice. Then she set it down, picked it up, set it down again. Karen, who was finishing her night shift and running on 3 hours of broken sleep and the specific triumphant exhaustion of someone who has been right about something important, watched this from across the station and said nothing. Dr. Hale looked up. She's speaking. Single sounds, Karen said. Consistent, intentional, and responsive to direct verbal stimulation. The neuro team is with her now. Dr. Hale looked at the report again. And the Miller man was present. He was. A silence. Is the daughter here? Slept in the family room. She's in with her now. Another silence longer, the kind of silence that contains a great deal of thinking that is not going to become speech. Then Dr. Hale set the chart down with considerably less force than she had used the first time several weeks ago, and said in a voice that was carefully stripped of anything but neutrality. Remove the visitor restriction from room 305. Karen looked at her. I'm sorry. You heard me? Dr. Hale picked up her coffee. Remove it. She walked away. Karen watched her go. And then, because she had been a night nurse for 16 years and had learned to take her moments of satisfaction in small doses and not gloat, she simply went to the access log, found the entry, and deleted the restriction. And that was that. David was home by 6 in the morning, showered and changed, and back at the hospital by 9 because he had taken a personal day from work, had called his supervisor at 7:30 and said, something's happening with someone I care about. I need to be there today. And his supervisor, who had known David Miller for 4 years and had never once heard him take a personal day for any reason, had said without hesitation, go, take what you need. He stopped at the bakery on his way in and bought coffee and a box of mixed pastries because Rachel and Mark had been in the hospital since the previous evening, and he didn't know what else to do with the feeling of needing to be useful. He left the box at the nurse's station for the staff and kept 2 coffees for Rachel. She was in the room when he got there. Mark had gone to find a hotel where they could shower and change, and Rachel was alone with her mother sitting in the bedside chair holding Margaret's hand and talking in the same low, steady voice she'd had through the night. She looked up when David came in, and her eyes were exhausted but clear. He handed her a coffee. She took it and said, she said something. David went still. What? This morning. About an hour ago, the neuro team was here. They were asking her questions, trying to assess verbal function, and she was making sounds. Some of them were close to words, but not quite. And then one of the doctors said her name, said Margaret. Can you tell us what year it is? And Rachel stopped, pressed her lips together, steadied herself. She said cold. That was the word. She said cold. Just like that. Clear as anything. And then she went back to the sounds. David sat down in his chair against the wall. Cold, he said. They think it might have been a response to the year question. She had a bad winter in 2022. Her pipes froze. There was a whole thing. Rachel shook her head slightly. Or it might have been something else entirely. They can't know yet. She paused. But it was a word, a real word. He looked at Margaret. Her eyes were closed again. She drifted in and out, the neuro team had explained, and that was expected. That was part of the process, the brain moving between states as it rebuilt its pathways, as it found its way back to the surface from whatever depth it had been at. But even in that stillness, something had changed. Something in the quality of it. The same monitors, the same machines, the same room, but the silence had a different texture now. Less like an ending, more like a pause between sentences. David, Rachel said. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay. Did you ever feel like it was pointless? Any of those nights, did you ever sit here and think this isn't doing anything? She's not hearing me. I'm just talking to a wall. He thought about it honestly. Some nights were harder than others, he said. Some nights I sat here and I wasn't sure of anything, but I kept coming back. He paused. I think I needed to be here as much as she needed me here. Maybe more. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. My mother had a hard time accepting help, she said. She was the kind of woman who needed to be the capable one in the room. It made things difficult between us. She had trouble saying she needed anyone. A pause. She would have been deeply uncomfortable with all of this, with being vulnerable, with someone seeing her this way. I know, David said. And then, I think that's why it worked. Rachel looked at him, questioning. She couldn't stop me, he said. She couldn't tell me to leave. She couldn't put up the wall. She just had to let someone be there. He paused. Maybe that was the thing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of two people sitting with a truth that was simultaneously simple and enormous. It was Rachel who spoke first. The nursing staff told me that Dr. Hale tried to have you removed. She did. And you came back anyway. Dr. Osei approved it. That's not what I'm saying, Rachel said. I'm saying you found a way back. She looked at him. I didn't. I got 4 emails and I sat with them for 6 weeks. That's different, Is it? He didn't answer immediately because she wasn't really asking the question. She was holding it the way you hold something heavy and familiar and overdue to be put down. He let her hold it. Then the thing that nobody was prepared for happened. Margaret Thompson said Rachel. Not a sound this time. A word. 2 syllables, rough and imperfect, the voice of someone using an instrument that has been still for too long, the way a piano sounds after years without tuning. The notes are there, the structure is intact, but the resonance is off, the precision missing, and what comes out is something that is recognizably music, but not yet quite right. But the word was there, the shape of it was unmistakable. Rachel was on her feet before she'd registered standing. She was at the bedside in one step. Margaret's eyes were open, both of them, more than they had been before, not fully, but more, and they were tracking. Slowly and with tremendous effort, but tracking. They found Rachel's face and stayed there. Mom, Rachel said. Her voice came apart on the word. Mom, I'm here. I'm right here. Margaret's mouth moved. Another attempt at sound. Rachel leaned in close and said, I can't hear you, Mom. Try again. The monitor showed a spike in activity. Margaret's hand tightened around Rachel's. And then in a voice that was barely a voice, barely more than shaped breath, Margaret Thompson said 3 words. 3 words that came out broken and slow and absolutely clear. You were gone. The room went very quiet. Rachel made a sound like something breaking open. I know, she said. I know, Mom. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She was crying fully now without holding back. Her forehead dropped to her mother's hand, her shoulders shaking. I'm here now. I'm not leaving. I promise you. I'm right here. David stood up from his chair. He moved to the door quietly because this was not his moment. This was a moment that belonged to the 2 women in the room and the years between them and the specific, complicated love that had survived all of it and brought them here to this room, to this exact convergence of what was broken and what was still possible. He put his hand on the doorframe and stood there for a second, and he looked at Margaret Thompson, really looked at her the way he had looked at her every night for 6 weeks, the woman who had pulled him into a relationship with his own life that he hadn't known he was missing. Then Jenny appeared at his elbow, tablet in hand, eyes bright. She's speaking in sentences. Jenny said in a whisper that was barely a whisper, that had the specific quality of someone containing something too large to fully contain. The EEG, David, you have to see this. She showed him the screen. The green lines moved differently than they had. Not the flat, minimal activity of the previous weeks, not even the elevated baseline of the last several days. Something fuller. Something that looked, even to his untrained eye, like a system coming back online. Is she going to be okay? He asked. Jenny hesitated because she was a nurse, and nurses knew the exact weight of those words. Then she said, I think she might be. He nodded. He looked back through the window at Rachel, who was still bent over her mother's hand, and at Margaret, whose eyes were still open, still tracking, still working at the enormous effort of being present in the world again. And he thought about what Margaret had said, those 3 words, the first coherent words she had spoken in 49 days. You were gone, not an accusation, a fact. The first thing she had needed to say when she found her voice again, the thing she had apparently been holding at the front of wherever her mind had been through the dark and the silence in the long absence. You were gone. He understood that. He understood it in the particular way you understand something that you've lived rather than something you've only heard about. He had been gone too in his own way for years. Gone from his kids, from his life, from the person he'd been before the slow, quiet erosion of a marriage, and a routine had taken up all the available space. He had walked into the wrong room and found something he hadn't known he was looking for, which was the experience of actually being somewhere on purpose, of showing up for something that mattered, of sitting in the dark with another person and refusing to treat their silence as an ending. He was thinking about Tyler and Sophie. He had been thinking about them since the night he'd called Tyler from the kitchen table. He pulled out his phone and typed a text to Tyler. Are you free this Saturday? I want to take you and your sister somewhere. Doesn't have to be anywhere big. Just out. Tyler texted back in under 2 minutes. The speed of it told David more than the words did. Yeah, we're free. He put the phone in his pocket. Down the corridor, Karen was on her way back from the end of the ward, moving with the deliberate efficiency of a night shift nurse, about to hand off after 16 hours on her feet. She saw David standing outside room 305 and raised her eyebrows in a question. He gave her a thumbs up. She stopped walking for a moment, and something moved across her face that she let stay there, something unguarded and real, the expression of someone for whom the work has just for a moment given back exactly what it asks. She nodded once, kept walking, inside room 305. Margaret Thompson said something else. Rachel lifted her head to hear it. It was quiet enough that David couldn't make it out from the doorway. But he saw Rachel's face when she heard it, and he saw it change, the grief still there, and the guilt still there. And underneath all of it, something else rising, something that had been submerged for a very long time, something warm and old and not yet lost. Later, Rachel would tell him what Margaret had said. The second thing she said after you were gone, the thing that came after in that slow and effortful voice shaped by a mouth relearning how to hold the words it had always known. She had said, you came back. Not a question, not an accusation, just the thing that mattered. The fact at the center of it all, the one that outweighed everything else. You came back. Whatever the distance had been, whatever the silence and the missed calls and the unanswered emails and the years of complicated love and complicated hurt. She had lain in the dark for 49 days, and the fact she'd held on to wasn't the leaving, it was the returning. David stood in the corridor of the ICU 3rd floor and felt something shift in him, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that announces itself, but the kind that you feel in your body before you feel it in your mind. A quiet internal realignment, the way a compass settles when it finally finds its bearing. He had walked into the wrong room. He had stayed for the right reasons, or reasons that had become right, or reasons he was still in the process of understanding. He had shown up every night for 6 weeks for a woman he didn't know, and in doing so had begun without entirely knowing it to find his way back to himself. His phone buzzed. Tyler again. Sophie says she wants to go to the aquarium. She's really into bioluminescent fish right now or something. David read the text twice. He thought about the night he'd told Margaret about Sophie's marine biology phase, sitting in the dark room, talking to the silence, not knowing if anyone was listening. He thought about how that conversation had felt, the loosening, the thing returning to range of motion after years of being locked. He had told Margaret things he hadn't told anyone, and she had been there. And now she was back. He typed back to Tyler, "The aquarium it is. Tell her to pick the weirdest fish she can find, and I'll read about it on the drive." He put the phone in his pocket. He turned back toward room 305. Through the window, he could see Rachel leaning close to her mother. He could see Margaret's hand resting in her daughter's. The fingers slightly curled, not the slack and open posture of deep unconsciousness, but something that had a shape to it now, something that held. And Dr. Patricia Hale came around the corner at exactly that moment, chart in hand, moving at her usual purposeful pace. She slowed when she reached room 305. She looked through the window at Rachel and Margaret. She looked at David. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. Then she looked back through the window, and she stood there for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and her face did something that David would spend a long time trying to describe to people later and never quite get right. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't exactly an acknowledgement. It was more like the expression of someone encountering evidence that has arrived inconveniently late, but is no less conclusive for that. She turned and continued down the corridor. David watched her go, watched. Then he looked back through the window at the room, at Margaret, at Rachel, at the small yellow tulips on the table slightly past their peak, doing their patient and imperfect best in their plastic pitcher by the wall. He pushed the door open and went back inside. Margaret Thompson spoke 12 words on the second day. The neuro team counted them, documented them, debated them with the careful enthusiasm of people who had expected far fewer. 17 words on the third day. On the fourth day, she asked for water, not a sound approximating water, not a gesture toward the cup, but the actual word clearly shaped directed at the nurse, who was adjusting her IV, followed by please, which made Karen, who was back on shift and had heard about it secondhand, go very quiet at her station for a full minute. David was there for the please. He heard it from his chair against the wall and felt it in his sternum like a struck chord. Rachel looked at him across the bed. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The neuro team's assessment on day 5 was delivered by a doctor named Patel, who was young and precise and had the specific manner of someone who found genuine joy in data, but had learned to deliver it at human speed. He sat across from Rachel in the consultation room and said, "The rate of recovery is faster than our models would have predicted at this stage. Significantly faster." He paused. "I want to be honest, we still have a long road. Speech therapy, physical therapy, cognitive assessment. There are going to be difficult days, but the trajectory..." He stopped, and something in his professional composure shifted just slightly, just enough to let something real show through. "The trajectory is remarkable." Rachel said, "Will she remember everything before the stroke?" "Her long-term memory appears largely intact," Dr. Patel said. "We'll know more as she becomes more verbal. But the indicators are positive." "In recent memory," a pause, "that's more variable. She may have gaps." He looked at Rachel. "She may not remember everything about the last 6 weeks." Rachel absorbed that. She thought about 49 days. She thought about what David had been doing in that room while she had been in Vermont not answering emails. Then she said carefully, "Does she remember the voice, the singing?" Dr. Patel's expression shifted again. "That," he said, "is actually something I'd like to discuss with you and Mr. Miller together if possible." They gathered in the consultation room 20 minutes later, Rachel, Mark, David, and Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel opened a folder and set it on the table and said, "This morning I asked Mrs. Thompson some orientation questions. Standard protocol, name, location, year, that kind of thing. And then because her chart indicated an unusual situation, I asked her something outside the standard protocol." He looked at his notes. "I asked her if she remembered anything from the period of her unconsciousness. Most patients say no. Most patients have no retrievable memory from that period." He paused. Mrs. Thompson said yes. No one in the room spoke. "I asked her what she remembered. She said, and I'm reading her exact words here, she said, a voice, a man. He kept singing the same song." Dr. Patel looked up from the folder. "I asked her what song. She said the Sunshine one. He didn't know all the words." The room was extremely quiet. David put his hand over his mouth. He sat that way for a moment. Then he lowered it and said, "She could hear me." "She heard you," Dr. Patel said. Not the careful clinical phrasing of someone hedging. Just the plain fact of it. Rachel made a sound. Mark put his arm around her. David stared at the table and felt something move through him that he didn't have a precise name for. It was larger than relief and more complex than happiness. It was the feeling of having done something in the dark without knowing whether it mattered, and then finding out in full daylight with clinical documentation that it had. That every off-key, forgotten verse whispered version of that song had arrived, had landed, had been received by someone who couldn't say so, and held onto for 49 days like a signal fire held against the dark. He didn't cry. He came close. He sat with his hand flat on the table and breathed through it, and when he felt steady, he said to Dr. Patel, "Can I see her, She's been asking about you," Dr. Patel said, "since this morning." He stopped walking when he heard that. She asked Karen who the man was. Karen told her your name. She said it back. The doctor's voice was even, but his eyes were not. She said it correctly on the first try. David walked down the corridor to room 305 and pushed the door open, and Margaret Thompson was awake. Both eyes open fully the way they had not been in any of his previous visits, the eyes of someone present in the room and aware of who was entering it. She was propped up slightly, her hair combed. Rachel had combed it that morning carefully, the way you perform a small act of love when the larger ones are still finding their shape. She looked thinner than he'd imagined she would look awake, smaller somehow, real in a way that the stillness of the previous weeks had not been real. A person fully instead of the idea of one. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she said in her slow and still rebuilding voice, "You're the singer." He laughed. It came out before he could do anything about it, a short, involuntary sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. "That's generous," he said. "I'm really not." The corner of her mouth moved, a fraction, the beginning of something. "No," she agreed. "You're not." He walked to the chair, his chair, the one Rachel had temporarily reclaimed, and then returned to him without saying so, and he sat down. Margaret watched him do it with the careful attention of someone relearning the details of the world. He said, "How are you feeling?" "And tired," she said. "Strange." A pause, the pause of someone choosing words from a supply that was still replenishing itself. "Like I've been away." "You have been," he said. "Tell me," she said. Not a question exactly, more like a direction. So he told her, simply the way he'd told everything else in that room, plainly without decoration. He told her about the wrong room, about the whiteboard with 42 on it, about coming back the next night and not knowing quite why. He told her about the singing, about the conversations, about what Dr. Osei had said about the EEG data, about Dr. Hale and the visitor restriction, and getting back in anyway. He told it the way you tell something to a person who already knows parts of it from a different angle, filling in the shape, not starting from scratch. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't know me." "No." "You could have kept walking." "I know." She looked at him directly with the steady assessment of someone who has had a great deal of time to think and has arrived at certain conclusions she is now testing against the evidence. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He had thought about this question since the beginning, had turned it over in the kitchen at 2 a.m. on the drive to work in the water treatment facility's weekly systems meeting, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He had several answers, all of them partially right, none of them sufficient on their own. He said, "Because the room was too quiet." She considered that. "That's all. That's the part I can put into words," he said. "The rest of it, I'm still figuring out." She nodded slowly as if this was an acceptable answer. Then she said something that he had not expected. She said, "I heard you, not all of it, not clearly, but the voice, I heard the voice." She paused and her breathing took on the slight effort it still required for sustained speech. "I couldn't find the surface. I knew it was up there. I just couldn't get to it." A pause. And then the voice started. "And I thought there's someone there. Someone is actually there." Her eyes were very clear and steady on his. "That's what brought me up. Not the medicine, not the machines, the fact that someone was there." David sat in the chair that had been his chair for 6 weeks and felt the full weight of those words settle over him. Not crushing, but substantial, the weight of something real and true. He said quietly, "I'm glad I walked into the wrong room." "So am I," Margaret Thompson said, and the corner of her mouth moved again further this time, And this time it completed itself and she smiled at him, small and slow and genuine. The smile of someone for whom smiling was still an act of deliberate assembly, and for that reason even more real. Rachel came in 20 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and stopped in the doorway when she saw her mother's expression. She looked from Margaret to David and back. She said, "What did I miss, boys?" "He was telling me he's a terrible singer," Margaret said. Rachel looked at David. He spread his hands. "It's accurate," he said. And Rachel sat on the edge of the bed and handed her mother a cup of coffee, decaf doctor's orders. Margaret noted with clear dissatisfaction, and for the next hour the 3 of them talked. Not about the stroke, not about the 49 days, not about the guilt or the distance or the things that had been left too long unsaid. They talked the way people talk when they have come through something together and are for the first time on the other side of it. About ordinary things, about Rachel's garden, about Tyler and Sophie, about the fact that Margaret had apparently been developing opinions about the nursing staff's coffee preferences 4 weeks without being able to express them, and now had significant things to say. David listened more than he talked. He watched Rachel with her mother, watched the careful negotiation of it, the old friction still present underneath the old hurt not gone, but both of them leaning toward each other anyway, doing the work of it in real time. He thought about what Margaret had said, not the medicine, not the machines. He thought about what it meant that presence, simple, stubborn, unqualified presence could do what the machines could measure but not provide. He thought about his kids. He left at 3 in the afternoon. Margaret was tired. She tired quickly, and everyone understood this, and no one took it personally. He stood at the door and said, "I'll come back tomorrow." Margaret said, "Bring better flowers next time. Those tulips are drooping." He looked at the tulips. They were drooping. He said, "Noted." She said, "And learned the second verse." He said, "I've been trying." She said, "Try harder," and closed her eyes. He drove to his ex-wife's house where Tyler and Sophie were for the week. He had not called ahead. He parked outside and sat for a moment, and then he got out and knocked on the door. Sandra answered and looked at him with the expression she usually reserved for unexpected developments, which was a careful neutrality that held multiple possible responses in reserve. He said, "I know it's not my day. I just wanted to see them for a few minutes if that's okay." Something in his face told her something she hadn't needed to know in a long time. She stepped back from the door and said, "They're in the living room." Sophie saw him first. She was 11 years old and had her mother's eyes and her great-grandmother's stubbornness, and she crossed the room at a pace that was technically a walk, but functionally something faster, and put her arms around his waist and held on, and David bent down and held her back and stayed there a moment longer than he normally would have, and she let him. Tyler was on the couch with his phone. He put it down when David came in, put it face down with the deliberate intention of someone choosing to be in a room and said, "Hey, Dad." Just that. But his voice had something in it that was different from the last several months of careful teenage distance, something that was recalibrating towards something warmer. David said, "Hey, Ty." He sat down on the couch next to him, not at the other end, next to him. Tyler didn't move away. Sophie said, "Are we still going to the aquarium on Saturday?" "Absolutely, Mom," David said. "You're going to show me the weirdest fish they have." "I already have a list," she said with the serene confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment. He stayed for 40 minutes. When he left, Sandra walked him to the door, and she said in the quiet voice she used when she was saying something that mattered, "She's getting better, the woman at the hospital." "Yeah," David said. "She is." Sandra looked at him for a moment. "You look different," she said. "You look..." She searched for the word, present. He thought about that on the drive home, present. He thought about what it had taken to get there: a wrong turn, a room number, a whiteboard with 42 on it, and a silence too full to leave alone. He thought about all the ways a person can be in the world without actually being in it. All the ways you can move through a life and leave almost no impression on it, like a stone, skipping across water, touching the surface repeatedly, but never going deep. He had gone deep in room 305, had sat in the dark with another person's silence, and refused to let it be just silence. And in doing so had found his way back to the depth of his own life. 2 weeks later, Margaret Thompson was transferred out of the ICU to a general recovery ward. She walked for the first time 4 steps with a physical therapist on one side and Karen on the other, and David and Rachel watching from the doorway, and those 4 steps had the quality of something enormous, being accomplished in miniature, the way the first word is enormous, the way the first day back from somewhere very far away is enormous in its smallness. Karen cried. She turned toward the wall and did it efficiently, and was back to professional before Margaret had completed the 4 steps. But David saw it, and Margaret, who saw most things, also saw it, and said in her dry and returning voice, "Don't make a fuss, Karen." Karen said without turning around, "I'm not making a fuss." Margaret said, "You were about to." Karen said, "I was not." And Rachel pressed her hand over her mouth and shook with something that was laughter and something else. And David stood in the doorway of the room that had been a wrong room and was now in some way he could not precisely define one of the most significant places he had ever stood, and he felt something so clear and complete that it was almost simple. The day before Margaret was discharged, Dr. Patricia Hale came to see her. David was not in the room when it happened. He heard about it from Karen, who had been close enough to the door to hear most of it without technically eavesdropping. Dr. Hale had sat in the chair by the bed, David's chair, and had said in her measured voice that she wanted to check in personally on Margaret's progress. Margaret had listened, had asked several sharp and coherent questions about her medication schedule that demonstrated her cognitive faculties were returning to their full and formidable operating capacity, and then had said, "I understand you tried to remove the man who was visiting me." A silence. Then Dr. Hale said, "I had concerns about protocol." Margaret said, the sound of someone choosing to say exactly one syllable. Another silence. Then Dr. Hale said, "I was wrong." Karen said she had to move away from the door at that point because one of the other nurses had needed something, and she hadn't been able to continue listening, and she said this with the specific frustration of someone who had wanted to hear what Margaret said in response and had been denied. But when Dr. Hale left the room, Karen noted her posture was slightly different, less braced. Something about the set of her shoulders that she had been carrying for 23 years set down just fractionally, just enough to notice. David's grandmother was discharged 3 days before Margaret. Nana L had made a full recovery from the hip and wrist was moving under her own power with the assistance of a cane she had declared she would tolerate but not enjoy, and had been told to take it easy for the next 4 to 6 weeks, to which she had responded with the expression she always used when medical professionals told her something she found unreasonable. In the car on the way home, she said to David, "Tell me about this woman." He had told Nana L pieces of it over the preceding weeks during his nightly visits, because Nana L had noticed something different in him and had asked with the directness that had always been her primary mode of communication what was going on. He had told her enough that she had a general shape of it. Now she wanted the rest. He told her everything. The whole arc. She listened in the passenger seat the way she had always listened, completely, without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes forward, her attention absolute. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You walked into the wrong room." "Yeah," David said. "And you stayed." "Yeah." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Your grandfather did something like that once. He sat with a man at a bus station for 3 hours. Man was a stranger, looked lost, didn't speak much English. Your grandfather just stayed. Missed 2 buses. Came home, and your grandmother," I said, "James, where have you been?" And he said, "Eleanor, I just couldn't leave him there." She paused. I thought that was the most remarkable thing I'd ever heard about a person. David drove and held that and felt it settle alongside everything else. "You got that from him," Nana L said. "I always thought you did. I just wasn't sure you knew it yet." Margaret was discharged on a Thursday morning. Rachel and Mark had arranged for her to come back with them to Vermont. Not permanently. They weren't calling it permanent. They were calling it temporary. A word that everyone in the family understood might mean many things and would be renegotiated later. Margaret had agreed with the specific grace of someone accepting help by reframing it as a practical decision rather than an emotional one, which Rachel understood was the closest her mother came to saying, "Thank you for needing me." David was there for the discharge. He had brought flowers, not tulips this time. He had listened when she said the tulips were drooping, and he had brought instead a small arrangement of yellow daisies that the woman at the flower shop had told him were nearly impossible to kill, which felt appropriate. Margaret looked at them and said, "Better." He said, "High praise." She said, "Don't push it." In the corridor, while Rachel was finalizing paperwork and Mark was bringing the car around, Margaret sat in the wheelchair the hospital required for discharge, and David stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment. In the way that two people are quiet when they have said most of what they needed to say, and what remains is larger than words and doesn't require them. Then Margaret said, "You'll visit in Vermont." It was not a question. "Yeah," he said, "I will." "Rachel likes you," she said. "She won't say so directly. That's not how she is, but she does." "I like her too." "She needs people who show up," Margaret said. Her voice was plain and clear and carried the authority of someone who had spent 77 years learning the difference between what matters and what doesn't. "She's had a hard time trusting that. We both have." A pause. "You're a person who shows up, David. I know that better than most." He crouched down to be at eye level with her, the way he did with Sophie, when he needed her to know he was really listening. He looked at Margaret Thompson, this woman he had not known existed 8 weeks ago, this woman who had pulled him back into the full depth of his own life by lying still and silent while he talked and sang and showed up and refused to stop. And he said, "You showed up too, Margaret. You just did it from further away." Her eyes held his, steady, clear, the eyes of someone who had come back from a very long way off and intended to stay. She said, "I had help." Rachel came around the corner with the paperwork clipboard and stopped when she saw them, and she took in the tableau, her mother in the wheelchair, David crouched beside her, the daisies in the chair's basket, the corridor of the third-floor ICU East Wing that had, over the course of 8 weeks, become the improbable location of several things that none of them had been looking for and all of them had needed. And her expression did the complicated, unguarded thing that it did when something was too real to process neutrally. She said, "Are we ready?" Margaret said, "We've been ready." David stood. He walked with them to the elevator, down to the lobby, through the automatic doors to where Mark had the car idling at the curb. He helped get Margaret settled in the back seat. He put the daisies on the seat beside her. She looked at them and then at him and said, "Learn the second verse, David. I mean it." "I've already started," he said. "Let me hear it at Christmas," she said. He said, "Deal." He closed the car door. Rachel stood beside him on the curb for a moment. She said, "You know she's going to hold you to that." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. The look of someone who has recently discovered that the world contains certain people who show up without being asked and stay without being thanked and change things without meaning to, and who is still adjusting to what it means to know one of them. She said, "Thank you, David, for all of it." She paused. "I don't think there's a word for what you did. Not really. I sang to your mother," he said, "very badly." "Stop it," she said, and her eyes went bright, and she hugged him quickly, firmly, the hug of someone who is not naturally a hugger doing it anyway, because it is the right response, and she has decided to be the person who does the right thing even when it's not comfortable. He hugged her back. She got in the car. The car pulled away. He stood on the curb and watched it go, and then stood there a moment longer in the particular way a person stands when something significant has just finished and they need a second to register it before moving into whatever comes next. His phone buzzed. "Sophie, Dad, did you know there's a fish that uses light to lure prey in the dark? It's called an anglerfish. We are definitely seeing this one Saturday." He smiled fully without effort, the smile of someone whose face has remembered how. He typed back, "Already looking forward to it." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked up at the front of St. Mary's Hospital, the building where he had been walking for 8 weeks, through the automatic doors, past Hector at the front desk, up the elevator, down the corridor, left at the first junction and right at the second, through the double doors past the nurse's station, to a room he had walked into by accident and never fully left. He stood there and breathed the cold January air and felt entirely, solidly, undeniably present in his life, in this moment, in the specific and irreplaceable fact of being a person who had been somewhere that mattered and had done something that mattered and had been changed by it in the ways that real things change you, which is to say, not dramatically, not all at once, but deeply and for good. He had walked into the wrong room. He had heard the silence and had answered it with the only thing he had: a voice off-key and unpracticed, and a willingness to come back the next night and the next, not because he knew it would work, but because the alternative was leaving someone alone in the dark, and he was not. It turned out the kind of man who could do that. He had not known that about himself before room 305. He knew it now. He would know it for the rest of his life, and it would be the thing he was most certain of about who he was, that when the room was too quiet and the whiteboard said 42 days and there was nobody else, he had stayed. He had stayed and he had sung, and she had heard him, and she had come back. And so in all the ways that mattered had he.